Thank you. Hello, my name is Ajay John. I'm a postdoc here at University of Washington. And this talk is a very specific talk. We do a lot of research up in the meadows and at Mount Rainier, but this is just looking one aspect of it, and this is very much emerging. So I'm looking forward for feedback as well on things how can be improved. So next slide, please. So want to acknowledge that this work took place at Mount Rainier, and it's happening every year, and it has been historically utilized and continues to be stewarded by peoples of Nisqually, Puyallups, Quasin, Muckleshoot, Yakima, and the Cowlitz Nations. Next slide, please. This is a meadow up in at a very high elevation, 700 meters, but this shows kind of the complex landscape and also the natural lab, if I may say, to actually conduct research, like climate research and to look at the studies or look at how climate is impacting this fragile ecosystem. Next slide, please. So I would like to show you a short clip. This is taken from a wildlife camera over one season. So next slide. Sorry. Yeah. So what you could, if you could play that, please. Yeah. So what you're seeing is that right around June, when these the meadows, when the flowering species emerge, and how you can see the climate influence on it, and how you can also see how the flowering, how the species are flowering, and then different species are emerging at different times of the year. So at different times in the same season. And it all culminates at the end with snow. And you guys just saw the light snow, but it ends with snow. And this happens to be majority of the time. So for these meadows, which draws millions of visitors every year, is constrained by the short window of the growing season. Next slide, please. One more. Yeah. So if I put them on time scale, so let's say beginning of the year to end of the year, you will see how majority of the time it is covered with snow. And the small window where the cleanup happens, that the species emerge, and there's flowering, and then there's die down, and then it repeats again. And if you split them for each individual flowering species, it's budding, flowering, and fruiting and seeding. And that is influenced by climate. So the next slide, please. And what we in the lab, and me per se, I'm interested in is actually peak flowering, and the studies have shown how the flowering and actually peak flowering being more distinct in a setting of a meadow. It could be used as a yardstick to know if it's an unusually warm season, is it shifting, or if there is a delayed snow melt, and is it shifting forward. So the next slide, please. So that is what's the key driver, and to know that, to know when the snow melts is actually the onset of these meadows, is the onset of the green up and the subsequent. So for the next slide, please. So what we, so and as Alia mentioned before too, and the presence of and when the snow melts also is very important. It actually affects the downstream services, or the downstream players as well, like the emergence of the pollinators. So if there is any shift in this, so that might cause synchrony, which might affect these other players which are in the same system. And actually, traditionally, what has been done is that we do field visits, so that we embed sensors to actually know when the snow melts, so that we can have an accurate, or so near accurate timing of when the peak flowering would occur, or actually might occur at a particular meadow. Next slide, please. Now, as the previous talk has given us some context, that snow can be observed with you are using remote sensing. So here we can also complement with apart from the remote sensing, like wildlife cameras as well. Uh, but that also gives us this opportunity that using remote sensing, we could then use um, use efficient algorithms to map the snow cover in on rather temporally, so that we could see when the snow presence is on and when it's off. Next slide, please. So this talk is especially about in alpine meadows where the snow is present majority of the time here. How could we improve that snow mapping using remote sensing? Next slide, please. So just a quick background, and I think some of this was touched on. So the remote sensing aspect of it is that to keep in mind is that these satellites have specialized sensors, rather optical sensors, which can look beyond the visible spectrum, which is what our naked eye can see. And here, what I've seen is that what I'm showing you is that one particular thing which you could look is apart from the individual bands is like a normalized difference of these bands. So I'm showing you one which is called normal vegetation index, which is I'm going to talk about, can be used to actually find out what's on the ground. So is it a vegetation? Is it a rock? Is it a soil kind of thing? Next slide, please. And now if you apply that on a complex landscape like Rainier, you can pick up different things. Either what do you see on the ground? And if you look at the vegetation per se, if it's covered with the snow, it would reflect more. So that's what you see on the y-axis is the band reflectance, and the different colors are red, green, blue, and near infrared. So there is a high absorption during the growing season, and then when the snow comes back on, then it is high. So we could use some of these aspects to some of these features to actually come up with the algorithm in the next step. So next slide, please. So yeah, so what we are using is actually CubeSats, so which are actually toaster sized, which I'll show you in the next slide. But also to keep in context that there are other providers like Sentinel and Landsat, which are much coarser and much coarser in terms of resolution, like spatio-temporally. Next slide, please. So these are very tiny, and what we've been using in this project is primarily Planet, because it gives us nearly 1 to 3 meters, 3 to 5 meter resolution, and more or less every other day you get an image. So just here showing you actually the comparison of how small these sensors of these CubeSats are. And also that there are other players like Black Sky also in this space now. And the next slide, please. And snow especially is actually has the presence of it is actually complicated by topography, the presence of canopy. So the more dense canopy it is, it buffers the snow underneath, and also persists the snow. The persistence persists the snow and underneath. The high elevation, so higher the elevation, the snow melts later, and actually slope and aspect of it also plays. So if it's on the south side, it melts faster. So it is complicated by this. So using a satellite image sensing can help us to uncover the heterogeneity in the snow. Next slide, please. And also, it actually varies by every year. So here, what I'm showing you is that on the y-axis are all the flowering species, all the focal species we found in Rainier, and how rather temporally when they flower also is a function of year. So if it's unusually warm year like 2015, you see that the flowering has shifted to in June, and in some of the other years it is normally in August, which is what we see. Next slide, please. And also it varies very spectrally. So the red is more where the snow presence is. So if you look at the almost at the bottom of it, it's much more constrained because that's a higher elevation meadow. Next slide, please. So what we did was in this experiment, we collected the planet imagery for nearly 5 years, and then we coupled that with the in-situ collection, where we had a temperature sensor buried in the snow, And we took to rather two trails where we had a lot of data on. This is on the south side of the Mount Rainier and the east side of it, where I have 16 plus kind of sites. And we clipped these sites and we looked at the imagery, and then we extracted the commonly found bands in this. And then we use these to find out, can we use this information, spectral information, to derive the snow presence and absence. Next slide, please. So we explored some of these indices. So VI is the vegetative indices. EVI is also a commonly used normalized index, which uses basically NIR red and blue, but we also have NDVI, which uses NIR and red reflectors. So using these indices, we evaluated which one could be the one which is most useful to derive the presence of snow. Next slide, please. So what we used is like something called a non-parametric technique. So this helps us to not to assume like a normal distribution, but this helps us is that to find out where the significant changes are happening. And this is a time series method, but we were able to apply that and see how actually feasible it is. So here I'm showing you 4 dotted lines. So, and actually what it is that you are seeing the beginning of the season, and here when there is an upward climb, that's when the snow starts melting, and then all of the peak is when the peak of green up happens, and then the snow comes on. So if we split it by 4 windows, we could get pretty much like the day of the year or the seasonal kind of breakup. The next slide, please. So what I'm showing you is that for these 2 trails, first of all, we needed to see, do we see something which we know of, that there is an elevational dependence. So the higher the elevation, the snow melts later. Rather do we see that? So here on the left side is the glacier basin, so which on the east side, and what we know is that the snow, first of all, melts earlier there. So that's actually you are seeing. So even before June in some of the years. And we see that on the Reflections Lake side, it comes later. So that's on the south side where the Paradise is. And then secondly, do we see the consistency sort of rather between the years, and which we do see here. So there is a very, like in 2017, like in 2017 we see in rather it was in a warmer year, and we see that the snow disappearance date is not following sort of the kind of this linear fashion. Next slide, please. So if we look at the difference between what we found using this method and what we found in the in-situ, we see that we are generally doing well in the forest canopies. So at the higher elevations, we do have problems. So in the problem in the sense there is a larger gap in the difference, which is more so happening in the glacier basin side where the snow melts earlier. But generally, if we are below, 2 weeks, that's a very good window to have. So another next slide, please. So to summarize, what we do find is that using the spectral indices are actually very valuable. So we could use them to estimate, but again, we need to compare, and I haven't shown you the other how other indices are faring, but something which I'm going to share soon. Second, rather meadows are complex, and complementary approaches which we could imply is that for the non-parametric window estimation, we could apply the parametric on top to actually look at it further. And the third is to look at other imageries, for example, from Sentinel and Interland Landsat, where we have much more spectral bands, so we could use those to actually complement this method. Yeah, so then next slide, please. Yeah, so we would like to acknowledge the National Park. So they've been great in actually supporting us for nearly 6 years now, doing this work. And there is another talk happening in the afternoon where you will learn more about this data as well, which we have used. And yeah, these are the great supporters of our project. That's all. So feel free for the questions.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks. Drop your questions in the chat if you could. Getting some nice applause. I had a quick question. Can you tell me again, what was the scale of the CubeSats?
So
You said
it's actually
the little toaster ones.
so it's actually 3 to 5 meters.
3 to 5 meters. Okay,
Meters,
I was
yes.
wondering that.
But generally, you can average it to 4 meters is what you get. Yeah.
Okay, and then in comparison again to Landsat and others, they were what, at 10 meters or?
Yeah. So Sentinel is 10 meters, and then Landsat is 30 meters.
30. Okay, thanks for that. Do we have any other questions out there? Great presentation. Lots of good partners. Got a question here. Great presentation. Any thoughts on the ability to characterize meadow phenology over larger areas using imagery such as sentinel and temporal segmentation? For example, CCDC.
Yes. Any thoughts on ability to? Yes, exactly. So it is a work which we have started where we are combining all the 3 imageries actually. So planet, Sentinel, and actually Landsat to get this large temporal coverage. So I think that would be since 2013. We have some results on it, and there has been a paper which we published a few years ago, which looks at one event, but this question is very key. That's our next hope, is that we can get much more finer phenology. So yes, it is possible, and we see that now the planet itself are actually coming up with more bands. So but which can overlap with the Sentinel and actually Landsat spectral bands as well. So yeah, so far it looks promising, but yeah, more work to be done on that.
Wow, nice. Thank you so much. Is there any other questions? Any other questions out there? We really appreciate you. Thanks for presenting for us today.